My name is Elyse Wild, and you are listening to Women's Lifestyle Magazine, Inspired Voices. Hi, welcome back to Inspired Voices. I hope you had a good weekend. The weather was really nice here in West Michigan. My husband and I went hiking at Seidman Park, which is one of my favorite places to go hiking in town. We actually went there twice. We went there Saturday and Sunday, and I put new soil in my first ever raised garden bed to grow my own vegetables, and I'm pretty excited about that. And I finally convinced my husband that we can get a dog. So we did a little bit of dog shopping, which is kind of a hard thing to do right now because everyone's getting a dog, which is great because most people are at home and they can spend the time with one. And so hopefully when this is all over, the shelters do not fill back up with dogs people are returning. Today on the podcast, we're going to be talking about another difficult subject. On Friday, we talked about systemic racism and the impact it's having on the mortality disparities of coronavirus. Which if you haven't listened to it yet, I encourage you to go back and listen. I talked to Raven Odom, who is a healthcare advocacy fellow at the Grand Rapids African American Health Institute. Today's topic is domestic violence during coronavirus, and I spoke to Erika Salerno, who is a family and divorce attorney and partner at Varnum Law. Throughout coronavirus is this huge event taking place around the globe, and then there's all these little micro events taking place within that, whether that be the mortality rate increasing for marginalized communities or domestic violence, which here in Kent County, domestic violence calls have gone up 50% since mid-March. And that's something that's happening all over the world, which Erika will explain. This is something that you might not feel like this concerns you if you're not in a situation of domestic violence or you don't know anyone in your life who has experienced it or is currently experiencing it. But it really is something that concerns all of us. There are so many flaws in the system that prevent victims from getting the help that they need. For me, in my opinion, I think it's primarily a woman's issue. And I know that there are men who experience domestic violence, but that the overall majority, it's women who are victims, and the flaws in the system have a direct impact on women in our community. So it's something that's really important, I think, to be on everybody's radar. It's something that we can all advocate for, find ways to advocate for. So within this conversation with Erika, I bring up a little bit of my personal experience with domestic violence. I am a domestic violence survivor. I was in a very abusive relationship many years ago, and I had extensive experience working with the legal system, everywhere from police officers to detectives to judges to probation officers. I came in contact with a lot of people within the system as I advocated for myself and for my own safety in that situation, which is something that, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and before the pandemic hit, I was planning on sharing that story with the readers of Women's Lifestyle, and I plan on still doing that. So come October, I'll share a little bit more of my story. As someone who has personal experience with it, it's hard to convey how helpless and hopeless you feel, even when you're working with the legal system and you're doing all the right things. It's still not enough. There are many loopholes within the law that allow a certain level of behavior from one person to another in domestic situations, and it can be a really hard thing to prosecute. That's not my legal opinion. I'm obviously not a lawyer, but in my personal experience, and I unfortunately had extensive personal experience with it because the person who I was in a relationship with who was abusive, after I took the steps to get them out of my apartment and get them out of my life, they continued to stalk me for years afterward. Again, I'll get into that more in October, but from personal experience, it is a just outstandingly difficult thing to deal with, and it doesn't stop once you pick up the phone to call the police, or once you call a lawyer, or once you start the ball rolling on prosecuting that person, or getting them out of your life. It doesn't stop there, and it brings up a whole new set of difficulties. That all being said, there are people right now who are in lockdown in quarantine with their abuser. Perhaps the stress of all of this is culminating in situations of domestic violence. There are many reasons why, and Erika gets into that. But as I said, it's one of those little micro events that's happening as a result of coronavirus. And I encourage you to listen to this podcast. And Erika has a lot of insight. She has a lot of great tips. If you are in a situation of domestic violence or domestic abuse, it doesn't necessarily have to be violence. There is a wide range of ways that one person can abuse another that doesn't involve violence. I encourage you to reach out to the resources that Erika lists in the podcast. We'll have links for those below. And if you know somebody who you strongly suspect or you can confirm is in a situation of domestic abuse or domestic violence right now during this lockdown, I encourage you to utilize the methods and the resources as outlined by Erika. And so all that being said, longest introduction ever. I hope you enjoy this podcast. As always, I hope you learn from it. And if you feel like it doesn't concern you, I hope you listen anyways, because it is something that concerns all of us. All right, with me today, I have Erika Salerno, who is a divorce and child custody attorney and partner at Varnum Law. So Erika, tell us a little bit about yourself, about how you got into law, and tell me what you like about it. Law seems to be one of those careers where I think people on the outside thinks that it looks like boring and tedious, but every attorney I've ever talked to loves their job, absolutely loves it.
Yeah, so I originally got into law when I was in high school. I thought I was going to pursue a career in government and politics. And so originally my plan was, I was going to use my law degree as a stepping stone to a career in the government. And when I got into it, I really found out that I enjoyed being in the courtroom immensely. And so when I graduated from law school, the first job I got was in family law, and I've been doing it ever since. And I think the reason why I continue to do it is that I really have a passion for the fact that you can really help people in a very tense and challenging personal time for them. And it's one of the few areas of the law that you really get to touch people's lives in such a personal way.
Mm-hmm. So what does, for those people who don't have experience with family law or may not know what it is, tell us, what is family law? Where does a person get in their life where they might need to contact someone like you for help?
Sure. So family law encompasses primarily dealing with divorce, child custody, child support, spousal support, but it can also include adoptions. I also do a lot of minor guardianship type work. So if an unfortunate circumstance comes and a parent or both parents or caretaker may die or get into a drug situation where they can no longer provide care for a child, then they can file a guardianship action. Mm-hmm. Pretty much anything involving legal matters involving caring for the custody of a child involves child custody matters.
Wow, yeah, so those are really pivotal moments in people's lives.
Yeah.
So one of the many unfortunate side effects of coronavirus and the shutdown is that domestic violence has really skyrocketed. I know WCCM reported a couple weeks ago that over a 2-week period, domestic violence cases increased 48% just in Kent County. That's pretty shocking. And I would imagine it's because victims are now essentially locked up with their abuser and without being able to go to work or school or without this support systems in place to kind of get respite from that. Can you give us a little insight into this?
Yeah, actually, the problem's bigger and wider than that. Okay. Statistics globally have indicated that the same pattern has repeated itself in China, in Italy, and in France.
Wow.
And I don't remember which country, but one of the areas found that their calls went down, which experts are actually looking at as a concern because people are afraid to call. You know, it doesn't quite make sense that in one country, for instance, or one geographic location, for instance, I know in Kalamazoo, they had an uptick, but in the city of Portage, they did not. So it's an interesting phenomenon, but you're absolutely right. Statistically, when we have people spend more and more time with families in close quarters, so for example, during the Christmas holiday season and during summer breaks, we also see that same uptick. in domestic violence cases. So now that is being magnified by the fact that, you know, even if there was a tense relationship to begin with, you're really not allowed or permitted under most legal circumstances to leave your home. So your normal support mechanism, which would be like your family, your friends, just your workplace, to sort of avoid the tense relationship and the potential violence, that those opportunities are closed to most people.
Yeah, that's really scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine, you know, I'm probably making assumptions here, but from an abuser's point of view, that perhaps the accountability to not be abusive is kind of gone now, because they also, you know, they're also not going to work or school or being around people that might hold them accountable to better behavior.
Right.
Which is, yeah, again, that's just a really scary situation for a lot of
Well,
people.
and I think one of the things that people can do is to, I mean, the most important thing you can really do is reach out to your loved ones. I mean, I think all of us, it's real easy to send a text, but even calling would probably be better, just to make sure that we're touching those people that we care about and would normally interact with on a day-to-day basis, particularly if you're a confidant of somebody or who have been a support person of them in the workplace, for instance, in the past. It'd be really important to maintain those conflicts and that continuity to that potential victim.
So this is not a fun question to ask, but I ask it also from experience. I had a situation involving domestic violence in my life quite a few years ago, and it escalated, and it at sometimes when I was calling the police or calling to file a complaint, what I took as abuse or as threats to my own life, the legal system didn't necessarily interpret them that way.
Right.
And that was something that was really frustrating for me, but I learned a lot about, you know, in that experience. So can you tell us what legally constitutes abuse?
So from a legal standpoint, what we tend to look at is, I mean, the easy things are where someone's being assaulted, physically injured, being hit, wounded. But the other things that are just as important, and I think, quite frankly, ultimately escalate into a violent incident, would be in a relationship where there's just a major control imbalance. So, you know, where someone is experiencing emotional put downs, being denigrated on a daily basis, told that they're crazy, that they're being intimidated with people smashing things or breaking things in the house, displays of weapons, attempts to destroy personal property, all of those things, in addition to like maybe placing economic barriers or economic boundaries, like for preventing access to financial funds, providing an allowance, those types of things are all what really make up the domestic violence piece. From a legal standpoint, essentially threatening to do any harm to somebody or making any remarks or taking any actions that would leave a reasonable person to believe that they are going to be harmed is how the law in Michigan anyway defines abuse.
So what are the signs that a loved one is being abused? So you just described kind of what abuse looks like on these different levels prior to escalating to physical violence. What are the signs that that is going on in someone's, like a loved one or a friend's life?
I think the primary sort of sign is isolation.
Okay.
So when you see a friend of yours starting to withdraw, not contacting you as much, refusing to go out maybe after work for a bite to eat or socialize at all, really keeping to themselves, I think that's the primary sign, is people start to self-isolate because they really don't know whom they can trust, but yet they're struggling to deal with it internally. And so that's probably the primary sign. The other sign would be unexplainable bruising, although most abusers are smart enough to hide that. And if you're a victim, you're doing your best to hide that from people as well, just because most people find it embarrassing, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so, but every once in a while, we'll find, I'll have a client come in and they may have a bruise on their face, and I screen and ask for that question. And so those are probably the primary ways that you're going to see people, is just a change in their behavior, and the isolation.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So right now, we're all in quarantine, and we all, speaking of isolation, we're all isolated from each other. So what can people do if they suspect that a friend or family member is being domestically abused during quarantine?
I think the primary thing that everyone can do to help a loved one who they believe is being abused is to make themselves part of that support team. Okay. So in other words, just make that extra effort to engage with that individual in some way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. Encourage that individual to reach out to resources like the National Domestic Violence Hotline, for instance. There's also a lot of great information on their website about, how to help others, and how the victim themselves can actually try to maintain as the peace as much as possible, right? Mm-hmm. Because there are tools that you can use to obviously deflect the anger as much as possible during this time. It's not, we always think, well, under a normal set of circumstances where we weren't under a quarantine, we would encourage that person to probably get out of that situation or to make a safety plan, but they're really not able to do that. So I think the best thing that we can do as friends and family of someone who's potentially being abused is to be that support person and potentially that resource in case things do escalate.
Mm-hmm. So for someone who's being abused, what can they do? I mean, you mentioned taking steps to keep the peace and to deflect anger, and to kind of mitigate something before it escalates. What are people supposed to do right now if they're in a situation where they're being abused and they're scared?
I always recommend, whether we're under quarantine or not, that any victim of abuse basically develop a safety plan. Mm-hmm. Now, the safety plan that they may do under quarantine is going to look a lot different than what they probably would have done had they had the ability to leave the house. But they should basically look for an area in their home where they can barricade themselves if violence escalates and can occur. They should also take measures into account to protect their children from that. One of the things that victims want to make sure that they do is never to take their children with them as they're fleeing, because then their children could become victims. And a lot of abusers will use the kids as a victim rather than even having any harm on the victim themselves, because they realize that to the victim, that's something that's almost even more important than their own personal safety. It's really important to exhibit self-care during this period of time. And obviously, when we're all under quarantine, our self-care is probably minimized to a certain extent. And so even having a cup of tea, reading a book, doing something that you enjoy, whether it be photography or even a coloring book and pencils, would anything that you're going to use to really be able to calm yourself and help you avoid the tense situation. And then, of course, talk to friends and neighbors and develop perhaps a code word, a text system, some way that you can signify to them that you need help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really important piece. As I spoke to the situation I went through a few years ago, I had a safety plan. I had a plan in place where I had called a friend and said, hey, if things are getting a little weird, I need you to promise me that you'll pick me up whatever time of the day or night that I call you. And that ended up, I mean, in the minute I did that, we set our plan into action. And that ended up being, it was helpful in the way that she was able to pick me up and take me away from the situation, but also that held me accountable to following through with that. And that is a piece that looking back on it, I didn't realize at the time, but being held accountable to that follow through was extraordinarily helpful, because it is a difficult situation to deal with. And you can often be in denial and just kind of want things to go back to normal, even though your normal is not healthy and is dangerous, and you might not realize it at the time.
One thing too, I think, to point out while we're under quarantine that's important is if you actually look at the governor's order, despite the fact that, it prohibits us from fishing, the fact that there is some stuff that is in there that really is an exception to allow neighbors and friends and family to care for other people.
Okay.
So I think it's important for friends to realize that if they had a friend who was in need and in trouble, that they could leave their home and certainly go and attempt to care for them. Now, obviously, they want to be careful when they do that and perhaps get the police involved. But if you had, the code word, set up to where, like you had mentioned, your friends were prepared to come pick you up, that could still work even though we are under quarantine. But obviously, we've all got to be careful when we're dealing with any type of violent situation. One other thing I didn't mention was it's important, I think, when you are being abused to always have your phone on you. And I know that's very difficult to do, but we always feel like we have our phones attached to us all the time. But I can't even imagine myself, and I don't have any abusive situation. I'm always looking for my phone, and even in the house, I misplace it all the time. So it's important for any potential victims out there to really keep that cell phone handy. There are various apps that you can use that would allow you to essentially press a button on your phone and be able to quick dial someone if you were in the need of assistance.
That's great to know.
Yeah, that's really helpful for people. There are some great resources on just cell phone safety as well, available at womenlaw.org, as well as I think it's techsavvy.com, that victims can, utilize to help them deal with not only electronic surveillance, which I know we haven't touched on yet, but also using potential apps as a safety mechanism.
So one thing that I'm curious at this time, and I'm sure a lot of people are wondering what they can expect out of the legal process once they, if they do take the steps to call the police on their abuser and to start the legal process of prosecuting that.
I think that, I'm sorry. I mean,
no. And then, I know, personal protection orders are a part of this situation for many people. Are the courts still processing PPO paperwork? How does this all work during coronavirus?
So each court in every county in Michigan is handling this differently, which is a little odd. For instance, I represent people in probably at least half a dozen counties in Michigan. And one county's clerk's office may be open to public traffic, including allowing people to file. However, the county right next door, who has probably the same amount of cases, if not less, may be closed completely. So it's important. I think the first place to start is if you're going to file a personal protection order, you can do it on your own by going to michiganlegalhelp.org.
Okay, good to
and
know.
That is a great website for people that are going to self-represent themselves. They can just log in and answer a series of questions. It kind of works very similar to TurboTax, believe it or not. And it will print out for you, once you've completed the process, all of the documents with a set of instructions. During the virus, the only real caveat is how you file that, right? So most domestic violence shelters, your community domestic violence shelter, it would be able to provide you with a resource on how to do that. I think almost all family law attorneys would do that for anybody in a heartbeat, quite frankly. I mean, I personally would. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you can, in the counties where they're open, obviously go and file that yourself. And so the courts are handling emergency matters. I mean, that's the important thing to know here. But one thing I always tell my survivors and victims is that those PPOs are they only really allow you an easy trip to the police, or allow your your abuser a quick trip to jail. And that's a very important thing. I'm not trying to minimize that at all. But the bottom line is they're not going to protect you from someone's physical abuse if that's what their end goal is. But they can be very, very important tools, and the courthouses are prepared and have been accepting those filings. But it does vary county by county in terms of how they're doing that.
I'm glad that you brought that up, that a PPO really, it's important, but it only does so much. And when I went through it a few years ago, I found that the way it was helpful for me was creating kind of a comprehensive paper trail for, going to court later on to start prosecuting things. But yeah, so I guess mitigating your expectations of what is going to come out of a PPO is good too.
Yeah, and I also think the one unfortunate thing about the judicial system is I think that the court in all things almost assumes, as a matter of fact, that everyone that comes in to see them is lying, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're a victim of domestic violence, you're a criminal defendant, or you're a parent in a family law case. It almost they assume as if everyone's not credible, and you're left having to prove that credibility. And that can be very traumatic and very difficult for anybody in an abusive situation, because I think they've already got a negative self-image of themselves and the situation that they're in. But then having to sort of rise above that, have the courage to actually try and do something about it, and then almost be told that, that you're not being believed or that you're not credible is difficult.
Yeah, sure.
And so it's important, I think, for people to also understand that, unfortunately, that prejudice, if you will, is almost ingrained in the judicial system.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a lot of my experience is really relevant to what we're talking about. When I was trying to get my PPO enforced a few years ago, I really felt strongly that I was not taken seriously, that assumptions were being made about me, until I actually went down to the courthouse in person and stood in front of someone and said, look, this is who I am. I am not who you're assuming I am. And even if I was, I need your help. I'm asking for help with this. And it was outrageously frustrating, but also, and I have known other people in my life that have gone through the process of getting a PPO and enforcing it. And my consultation to them has been, be prepared for these feelings. It's going to be very difficult to deal with. And like you said, it almost enforces, in a weird way, it almost reinforces the abuser's perspective of you, or what they're trying to make you view yourself as. And that's so hard to deal with. I have told everyone I know the same thing of just, be prepared for this, and use all the personal resources you have to get support to get through this.
Yeah, and I think every county has awesome resources. I mean, in terms of having a domestic violence shelter, or some type of a nonprofit unit that deals with domestic violence. I do a lot of my work in Kalamazoo County. They have the YWCA. Grand Rapids, Kent County has the YWCA. There's another organization, I think, called Safe Harbor in Ann Arbor. So, I mean, we have great resources.
Mhm.
I think it can be challenging having the ability to access those resources. And, I also think right now, because they're limited with a small shortage of volunteers and that type of thing, that I'm sure they're having challenges meeting those demands as well.
Mhm.
And so the national hotline is also another resource, because they can sort of pick up the slack where maybe the local domestic violence nonprofits might be challenged at the moment.
So you mentioned earlier electronic surveillance and that you have some tips on how to counter that. Can you tell us a little bit about how electronic surveillance is used by abusers and how people and what those tips are for people to combat that?
So there are several apps that would be able to provide, if an abuser downloads it on your phone, which is not impossible, um, if they somehow manage to get it on your phone or your laptop, can track you, your location. And we think about it just being a phone or laptop, but there is a lot of information that we have nowadays that I don't think people realize how much of a footprint they leave electronically on a day-to-day basis. So one example would be if you had one of those fancy like thermostats, right? The Alexa thermostat or whatever. If you came home and adjusted that thermostat, right, uh, your potential abuser is getting that information immediately by phone. If
Wow.
you have one of those Ring video cameras on your doorbell, they're knowing exactly when you're coming and going without even downloading a fancy app.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, first of all, everyone needs to be aware of the fact that you can be traced, or a lot of what we do throughout the day leaves an electronic footprint. The other thing that I think is concerning is, particularly when I'm dealing with people in the middle of a divorce or post-divorce even, your children's electronics can be traced. And your inclination may not necessarily be to look at their stuff necessarily, depending on their age, but certainly their phones can be, location devices can be placed on their phones, or if even they're posting to Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat, your abuser could be a friend of theirs or linked in a way that they can assume that obviously you're tagging along wherever they are. So I think the first thing is to just develop that awareness as to, how we can be tracked electronically in a very simple way, quite honestly. The other thing is just making sure that your social media and all of your passwords to accounts and websites and all of that stuff is locked down.
Mm-hmm.
One thing, simple thing all of us can do is to ensure we have a 6-digit passcode instead of just the 4-digit passcode on our devices. The other thing that we can do is make sure we're not keeping notes in regards to passwords and that on our cell phone itself. I think a lot of people just go in and write a big long note with all their passwords on their iPhone, right? Or they have one place there where they keep all that information. That's not a good idea, because if an abuser gets your phone, they can easily unlock it at night if they take a snapshot of you, if you have face identification or even a thumbprint of you.
Oh my gosh.
So, I mean, it can be scary. We have all these security things, but at the same time, they are vulnerable. Um, Other things that you can do would be to potentially turn off all your notifications, because notifications pop up on a cell phone most of the time immediately, and those are visible to people. They're even visible if you have an iWatch or some type of Fitbit. And that can obviously provide information to your potential abuser about who you're communicating with, and that type of thing. Turning off the location on your cell phone so that that's not tracked. And then every once in a while, you want to look at it and delete any unknown apps that you might see, because that's a sign that someone's been tampering with your phone. if you get to a point where you're concerned that your communication and your electronic devices have been really tampered with and there is no privacy, you can always purchase a burner phone,
Okay.
and then just use that and throw it away once you're done with it. But that's probably the most extreme thing. But the other things are things that really you can do to protect yourself and your privacy at all times, not just if you're a victim.
Yeah, that's great to know. Really good information, especially if you are at the steps where you are forming a safety plan and, kind of a escape plan, if you will. You're going to have to assumingly communicate with your support network through your phone, through your electronic devices. And so that can be a really huge safety issue as well with those devices.
Yeah.
So what resources are there in the community for people who may have to flee their homes due to domestic violence at this time?
Like I mentioned, all the shelters remain open. I have read articles. I haven't read anything about Michigan necessarily, but other communities where they have decided to, I think it was New York, they decided to put people up in hotels that were not being occupied because their shelter was having an extreme increase in occupancy. And so the shelters are really the primary place to go. Unless you have obviously family or a support group and that you can rely on to kind of keep you safe.
Mm-hmm.
But at this time, those are really the same options that we would normally have in a different situation. And again, I wouldn't let the governor's order prevent me from taking somebody in if they had a situation. There's nothing in there that I can see that would really prohibit that at all. And so I think that in any kind of an emergency situation, friends and family would be willing and able to support people during that time.
Well, thank you so much for your time and offering your insight and expertise into this. Is there anything else you'd like to say about what's going on right now, or what your hopes are for our immediate future in this situation?
Well, I mean, my hope is that obviously that we can all get through this with learning a little bit and taking it in a positive way. I mean, I think myself, the best thing I've been able to do from this is spend more time with my family.
Mm-hmm.
It's very rare that I would ever get more than a week's vacation to spend with them at a time. So this has allowed me to work from home and have a lot more flexibility. But also, I think it's a good opportunity for those of us um, who really are touched by the stories of like others who are giving back by
Yeah.
whether it's making masks for people or donating to food drives or donating to the domestic violence shelter. So a lot of good is coming from this. I just hope it doesn't change our quote unquote normal too much.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the challenge, I think, is that as we come out of this, that the good things about what we enjoyed, we continue to enjoy, and that they're, not sort of driven out of business and erased from our everyday life.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Erika. I hope you found it illuminating. I hope that you are not experiencing domestic abuse right now. If you are, I hope this podcast helps you. And we have links below to some resources that people can go to for help. One of them is Safe Haven Ministries. Their number is 616-452-6664, safehavenministries.org. They provide emergency shelter and resources to domestic violence victims. Then there is the YWCA West Central Michigan, 616-454-9922, YWCAWCMI.org. The YWCA also provides emergency shelter and resources to domestic violence victims. And then there is the National Domestic Violence Hotline that Erika spoke of. That is 1-800-799-723. They have web resources at thehotline.org. As we keep saying, we will get through this together. And I think, again, as I said in the intro, there are all of these little micro events that are emerging as a result of coronavirus. So now I've kind of changed my thinking to we will get through this together. Like, yeah, we're going to get through this pandemic together, hopefully with the most positive outcome possible. But also, we got to kind of concentrate on all these little micro events too and getting through those together. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll have another episode for you guys in a couple days. To stay in touch with us, please visit www.womenslifestyle.com and sign up for our newsletter. You can also listen to this podcast on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is Women's Lifestyle, all one word. If you have any ideas for a podcast episode, or if you'd like to hear from someone we haven't interviewed yet, please reach out to me at elyse@womenslifestyle.com. That's Elyse at womenslifestyle.com. I hope you are all staying healthy and staying safe, and thank you so much for listening.